If you have a startup idea and your plan is to fund it with dollars from investors, it's a very good idea to ask yourself, is this idea itself even investor fundable? In today's video, I'll talk about 6 criteria I'd suggest you think about to answer that question. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. Now, it does take a lot of work to get investment from investors for a startup. It takes the right execution. It takes doing the right things, making some headway, hitting some milestones. And that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk more about really the idea itself. Does the idea that you have the right attributes to be able to get interest from investors who invest in startups? Now, there are some complications in deciding whether or not your idea is fundable, because the reality is all investors are different. They come from different backgrounds, have different criteria, they look at deals differently. So it's a challenge to generalize, but I think you can make some general statements about particular attributes that the vast majority of investors are going to look for in an idea before they decide that maybe they'll consider investing. So those are the kinds of attributes we'll talk about. The other challenge is that, of course, there are always going to be exceptions to the rule. You can always find a deal out there that violates, one of the attributes that I'll be talking about. But I think you'll find that those exceptions, they're few and far between. So I think the following 6 attributes are a pretty safe list to think about in terms of deciding whether your idea actually is investor fundable. Attribute number 1, there has to be the potential for a high return on the investment. Angel investors in particular know that startups are risky, and a lot of what they invest in, a lot of the startups in their portfolio aren't going to return anything. Others will return just a little bit, and a very small number in the portfolio will hopefully get a very good return. Now, I'm going to define very good as being at least 5x, maybe 10x, or even better. 5 to 10x what the investor actually put into the company. That's a pretty substantial return. But when you have a situation where a lot of your portfolio returns nothing and a fair amount returns only a little bit, you need that kind of home run potential for your overall portfolio investment to have some reasonable financial return. That's why investors tend to look for the potential that your idea could return a lot on their investment, like 5x, 10x, or for a venture capital investor, even a lot more than that. So that's a big question. Does your idea have the potential for a big return? If it's an idea that serves primarily a local market, not a national or international market, odds are it's not going to create that kind of return. So it needs to be a scalable idea, something that can scale nationally or even internationally to provide the kind of return that investors, especially angel investors in startups, are looking for. And there has to be some kind of an exit strategy. There has to be the potential that there are companies out there that will want to buy your company after you make enough headway to prove it out, and they'll want to buy it for a large enough amount that it provides that kind of excellent return. So those are a couple of key questions to ask yourself. Is your idea scalable to at least a national or an international market? And if the company does well, are there companies out there that will have the resources and the motivation to actually buy your company and to buy it for enough money that your investors can make a very good return? Attribute number 2, you really need to understand the customer that you'll be selling to. If your idea has to do with providing a solution to a market where you've never been a customer in that market, you've never been a provider that served that market, you don't have anybody else on your team that's been either a customer or a provider in that market, those are all bad signs. Your knowledge then of that market is a little bit theoretical, and it's hard to give investors confidence that you really understand the customer well enough to address their need. You can certainly do extensive customer discovery to try to make up for that, to try to be sure that you actually do understand the customers. In fact, that would be critically important in actually just about any startup, but especially in a startup when you haven't been either a customer or a provider in that market before. So that's always an important criteria. An investor has to believe that you really understand the customer and the market. Attribute number 3, it needs to be an underserved market. There has to be a segment of the market that isn't getting the solution that they want and need. Either they're not getting the pain they have fully addressed, or they're not getting the gain that they'd like to get out of the solutions that are currently available. In other words, the value proposition just really isn't being fully addressed for those customers. That's what creates an opportunity for a new entrant to participate in a market. So you have to ask yourself, is this really underserved? I mean, are there a lot of other companies out there already addressing this need that you've identified? Or is there really a segment that's not being addressed, at least not being addressed with a solution that is acceptable to customers? Closely related to number 3 is attribute 4, a compelling reason to buy. Just because you've identified a segment that has a need that's not being addressed very well does not necessarily mean that people or companies will buy your solution. There needs to be a compelling reason to buy. In too many cases, you have a situation where the solution, although not perfect, although you can identify disadvantages of the solution, it's good enough, and it's the solution the customer knows, the customer is comfortable with. You know, it's like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't kind of scenario. And it may be that there are a bunch of other problems the customer has that are just way higher priority than this one. This one that you're addressing is maybe, okay, not a great solution, but it's good enough. We got much more important issues to worry about. That's a scenario where, again, logically what you're doing can make perfect sense. You can show in a comparison how your solution is better than the competition, and yet have a situation where you bring it to market and nobody buys it. So you need to be able to convince yourself and investors that there actually is a compelling reason for customers to buy the solution that you intend to create. Having an existing solution out there that's not very good isn't enough. Customers have to be motivated to buy. Attribute number 5, capital efficient solution. Okay, if your solution costs a huge amount of money in terms of investing in capital equipment for a manufacturing facility, in terms of buying raw material and so forth, that makes it a lot harder to get funded. Now, on the other extreme would be, say, a software idea, which is very capital efficient. You need some computers, you need programmers, you don't need big factories, you don't need a huge budget for machinery, you don't have to buy a lot of raw material. It's a very capital efficient business model if you're just developing software. There are clearly opportunities out there where you have to build a thing that involves a factory, that involves machinery, and clearly it's possible to fund those things. It's just a lot harder the more capital that's required. So going into it, you need to be aware of that, and you need to keep your eyes open for ways that you can reduce the capital requirement from an investor point of view. For example, if you have some kind of a technology idea, you might want to look into the SBIR and STTR programs. Those are U.S. federal government programs that fund R&D for tech startups in the United States to the tune of multiple billions of dollars each year. So if you have a technology idea and it involves building hardware, or actually it can involve software too to qualify for the program, but especially if it involves the expense of building a factory, having to buy equipment and so forth, check out those two programs, because those can help defer that cost from an investor point of view, at least through the R&D process, and make your startup idea a lot more attractive to investors, because they only have to invest a little bit later when you're closer to a go-to-market strategy. So capital efficiency, the amount of funding that's required to get your product to market, is another thing to think about in terms of deciding if your idea is actually fundable. Final consideration is sustainable advantage. Now, this crosses over a little bit into doing the right things as opposed to the attribute of your idea itself, but it's still a very important one. Why is it that you are going to win against the competition? What is the advantage you're going to bring to market? Whatever product you bring to market, odds are, all other things being equal, that somebody can duplicate that, somebody can copy it. So a product itself doesn't necessarily provide you with a sustainable advantage. Now, if you have a patented process that gives you some advantage that other people can't copy, okay, that is a sustainable advantage. Or maybe you have know-how that's hard to figure out that you keep as a trade secret. That can be a sustainable advantage. Or you nail down a key partnership with a partner that gives you an important advantage in the market. Or you get a key customer nailed down that gives you a big advantage, a big amount of credibility in entering a particular market. Those can all be sustainable advantages. So it's another thing to think about that greatly increases the likelihood of you getting funding. Do you have a sustainable advantage that gives you a compelling ongoing competitive advantage in pursuing your target market? So those are 6 attributes to think about when you're asking yourself, is my idea even fundable? Will investors even consider investing in it? Again, you have to do the right things to get the money. Nobody's going to invest in your idea when it's at the idea stage. But if your idea has these 6 attributes and you do the right things, then there's a good chance you'll be able to get investors interested in investing in your startup. If this was helpful, please click the like button and share it with other entrepreneurs who might benefit from it. If you have any comments or feedback, please leave a comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, of course, please do that and click that bell for notification, because there's yet more coming up in this series on startup funding strategy. And of course, there's a link to the sequence of videos on startup funding strategy right here. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.